We have Dr. Dominick from Herminius. Many of you will know Dominick. The great thing about Herminius, they advise the Joint War Risk Committee, but they're not shy about saying it as it comes. So that's why we've got Dominick, because he's certainly going to make set out the big calls.
Hello, everyone. I am generally more a glass half full person, but the reality of the kind of brief that I've got and the kind of questions that people ask means that one tends to focus on the bad. We are, as humans, hardwired to look for the anomalous. We tend not to pay enough attention to what's just generally happening while the anomalies are popping up. So what I have to say, I would suggest, bear in mind that this is sort of looking at the anomalies rather than the broad pattern, and perhaps we might have a discussion around the broad pattern. I was asked to think about future geopolitics after 2030, and I have to say that generally speaking, thinking about geopolitics, predicting geopolitics beyond 5 years is a mug's game. There are too many unknown unknowns. All kinds of stuff happens. You may get a pandemic. You may get a sudden return of massive interstate war on the European landmass. You know, stuff happens. So one can't predict everything with any reliability beyond, I would suggest, about 5 years. So I'm giving this a stab until 2029. So the things that I think we are likely to see in terms of broad trends as they affect the shipping world writ large. Firstly, I think Ukraine's going to win the war with Russia, but sanctions are going to remain and evolve for years to come. Secondly, Russia is going to become, in inverted commas, an enemy for Western Europe. It's going to be a bit like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, sort of shut out of Europe's regulatory, legal, economic space, with Europe rebuilding all of its defense efforts specifically focused on the Russian threat. So Russia's going to become an enemy for Western Europe, and conceivably the US, if Trump is not re-elected, for at least 2 changes of leadership in the Kremlin. And I say that because the reality of Russian politics is that if Putin goes, there's no safe, sweet landing spot for something nicer. He's going to be replaced by somebody nastier, with a nastier agenda, more nationalist, more obviously fascist, and there's going to have to be at least a reaction to that before the West gets a constructive actor in the Kremlin. So we're looking at Russia becoming an enemy for at least 2 changes of leadership in Moscow. I think for the next 5 years, shipping interests are going to be targets of state action linked to this largely Cold War. So we're not going to see European states fighting Russia. We're not going to see NATO fighting Russia. It's going to remain a Cold War, but in other arenas, there's going to be no question about who is hostile and who is not. And I think shipping interests are going to get caught up in this. They're going to be the targets of state action through sanctions enforcement, through seizure or expropriation, through armed attack, probably deniable. And we're going to see, I think, cables, oil and gas infrastructure and information systems all being tested. The next point I would make briefly is that China's relations with the West, they're going to worsen whatever the West does. And that's for reasons that are fundamental to China. They're not about the West. So even if the West decides that it desperately wants to be very friendly with China and works really hard at it, the way the Chinese system works, China will end up pissing off the West, pissing off the United States, and you're going to have something of a political divide between the West and China. It's worth bearing in mind that that doesn't necessarily translate into a kind of cold economic war between the West and China. China wants something different from the world order, than Russia. Russia wants to break the world order. China wants to make it work to its advantage. And the analogy I use is a playground. The world is a playground. Countries are the children that are released onto the playground at break time. Russia doesn't want any teachers in the playground, doesn't want any rules in the playground, because Russia may not be the largest child in the playground, but is probably ready to be the meanest, so can get what it wants simply by beating people up or through coercion. China, on the other hand, wants lots of teachers in the playground, lots of rules in the playground, but most of them favoring China. So they want different things. So we're not going to see a kind of big divide, I think, on the economic front between the West and China, but there are going to be difficulties. Now, de-risking and friend-shoring is going to limit Western vulnerabilities on this, but the real risk of Chinese economic collapse or military confrontation, or both, must be factored in before 2031. That's an incredibly long and complicated subject. Happy to talk to some of you about it if you wish, but broadly speaking, I think the risk of economic collapse or open conflict involving China is moderately high before 2031. Do you want me to shut up now?
That is, oh, sorry, were you about to shut up? Or?
I was about, there is other stuff, but I will be quiet about it.
That's fine. I did actually have a question for you, and that really is one of the things I think that's probably surprised everybody is that Russia hasn't already won and did not win in a very short space of time. And I'm guessing that people the world over are sitting there thinking, well, hang on, if the world's second largest military with, I think, the world's largest nuclear arsenal cannot quell a third, fourth rate military power like Ukraine, what does that mean for me? So does that, in your opinion, make the advancement of foreign policy aims and all the instability that comes with it less likely through armed conflict, or do you think I mean, the obvious one is Taiwan and China. Has the lessons that have been learnt by the world that actually driving tanks into somebody else's country, if they're determined, isn't going to work, has that really changed people's perceptions, do you think?
I think people undertake activities of this kind, adventures of this kind, for their own reasons. So while China may look at what's happened in Ukraine and try to draw lessons, they're the lessons that will suit China's internal political system, that will suit the highly politicized military that they have, and will suit their world view. So the thing that will worry them is not so much Russian military performance, which is alarming, but they wouldn't necessarily count on Russian military performance anyway. What will worry them more is the way that technology is evolving and how they will adapt to that. Because essentially, the Chinese military is, if you think militaries are hidebound, which they are, and they've got long traditions and they do things a certain way because they've always done them that way, if you think that's true of militaries generally, the PLA, which is a political army, is very much like that. So the things they have to do internally to adapt to new technology are very scary for them. And because of the way their information systems work, they will not do what they need to do, they will do what they think the system can bear, and that's very different. So as a very brief example, you'll all be aware of the notion probably of joint operations, where air, sea, land all work together to achieve one objective. The People's Liberation Army cannot do joint operations. They will probably never be able to do joint operations. They can't admit that they will never be able to do joint operations, because the reason why they can't do them is the reason for being of the People's Liberation Army. So the reason they can't do it is because of politics. Essentially, if you're going to do joint operations, it's incredibly complicated. You do exercise after exercise after exercise, everything goes wrong. You do it again and again, things get better. You do it again and again, things get better still. It's a constant iterative process. In a politicized military, there is no lessons learned. There is only blame. So if the army don't turn up to get the landing craft, that's a problem of, as far as the army is concerned, of the Navy. The Navy didn't put the landing craft where we wanted them to be. If the Air Force don't turn up, as far as the Navy and the Army are concerned, the Air Force are responsible. And there's then a huge political fight about that. So what it means is that they can't actually join everything together because of the politics of the system. And so the lesson they should draw from Ukraine is not necessarily the lesson that they will draw.